and Altruism, Research and Education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kelly McGonigal.
So as Dr. Paula just told you about, the ability to feel compassion for others is part of our human nature. And yet many people find that when it's time to turn that compassion onto themselves, it is much more difficult. Have you had this experience? Yeah. So it's my hope today to give you a little bit of motivation to want to train and develop that capacity to send compassion to yourself. And then later this afternoon, if you come to the workshop, we'll do some in-depth practices in cultivating self-compassion. So I'm going to start by showing you a very unusual happiness intervention. Now, Dr. Luskin told us earlier this morning that if you want to create happiness, focusing on misery is not the way to do it. And yet, I want to tell you about a study where the happiness intervention was explicitly, think about the worst thing that happened to you today. At the end of the day, you're just going to sit, you're going to think about it, even write about it, for 5 to 15 minutes. And even though that shouldn't make people happy, the data suggests that it significantly reduces depression and increases happiness. And people only needed to do this for 1 week. It was just that first week where they were thinking about the worst thing that happened to them each day at the end of the day. And the effect was long-lasting and cumulative. So something that they were doing while they were focusing on the worst thing that happened to them somehow taught them a skill that was helpful in reducing depression, reducing their own suffering, and increasing happiness. And it turns out that there's more than one way to think about your own suffering. There's a way that leads to more misery, and there's a way that actually leads to less suffering and greater happiness. And what you're looking at here are some slides from a recent study by Dr. Paul Gilbert, who's a major self-compassion researcher, as well as his colleagues, looking at what happens in the brain when you think about or imagine something really terrible happening to you. For example, receiving a 3rd job rejection in a row. And in this study, they asked people to think about distressing events like rejection in one of 2 ways. So the first way is to think about it in the way that we typically think about distressing situations. To take a very self-critical and harsh approach. You've probably done this yourself. So for the example of receiving another job rejection, it might be something like, I'm never going to get a job, what's wrong with me, I don't have what it takes. That kind of self-beating that we engage in. It's all my fault, I should have been better at the interview. When we engage in self-reflection in this way, the self-critical and harsh way, it activates the regions of the brain that are associated with defense, threat, self-inhibition, and self-judgment, what Dr. Hansen would refer to as that reactive mode. And yet, if you think about the exact same situation in a more self-nurturing way, where you might say to yourself something like, boy, I can see how upset you are. You really wanted that job. This is difficult to receive so many rejections, especially when you put so much time into this. And you really want to be of some service in the world and to get a job. And you just think about the situation in a more self-soothing or self-understanding way. It puts you in what Dr. Hansen talked about as the responsive mode of the brain. It's a totally different experience for the brain, it's a totally different experience for your body and for yourself. And just to get a sense of what you're looking at in these brain regions here, these are axial views. If you imagine someone taking an axe, cutting my head in half, removing the top of my head, and then you're going to peer down and see what's happening. You can see in this first image, some of the most activated areas when we're thinking self-critically are areas of the brain that are associated with self-inhibition, controlling yourself, as well as some areas you can't see on this slide that are associated with punishment and self-punishment. And in the bottom side, what you're looking at here is that same axial view, as well as a side view. And these are regions associated with compassion and understanding what's happening in the body, including the insula, which you've heard about in a few different talks. And so when we think about something that makes us very unhappy, but we do it in a way that is self-understanding and self-compassionate, we're actually activating that responsive mode, and that mode that allows us to feel connected to ourselves and to others. And in fact, as you mentioned, I talked about the happiness intervention. It was specifically asking people to think about and write about that worst thing that happened in the course of the day from a self-compassionate point of view. And they were asked at the end of every day to write themselves a letter about their upsetting situation, thinking about what you would say to a friend in your position, or what a dear friend would say to you. And to try to have a sense of understanding and empathy for your own stress. And make sure that the letter provides you with whatever it is that you need to feel nurtured and encouraged and motivated and cared for. And it was this intervention that led to those significant increases in happiness and decreases in depression as long as 6 months after people did this for just 1 week. And essentially what you can think of as this little self-compassion intervention, it was training the brain, it was rewiring the brain, as Dr. Hanson talked about, to be more likely to slide into that responsive mode, as opposed to staying in that reactive, self-defensive, and self-critical mode. And as it turns out, you can tell a lot about someone's well-being and mental health by how self-compassionate they are. Multiple studies show that people who are more self-compassionate are in general happier, they're more optimistic, and they have greater social connection. They also experience less anxiety, less depression, less self-criticism, and less unhealthy perfectionism. That is that sense that nothing you do is ever going to be good enough. It also protects against some of those mental traps that Dr. Luskin talked about. Falling into social comparison. Am I as good as other people? Or what other people think about me? Social anxiety, anger, judgment, and closed-mindedness. People who practice compassion with themselves find that spontaneously they are more able to relate to others in a way that includes forgiveness and connection and acceptance. And it's not just people who are naturally self-compassionate who show these benefits. You can learn to be more self-compassionate. And several studies are showing that when people take a brief self-compassion training, it improves mental health, reduces depression, and other positive benefits. Okay, so usually when I start to talk to people about self-compassion, people get very uneasy. And they'll even believe the research that it might make you happy, but they have a profound mistrust of what will happen if they let themselves off the hook. And many people fear that if they become self-compassionate, what that means is they're going to turn into a giant sloth who never wants to get off the couch, only wants to eat candy and play video games all day, will never get their work done, will never call their mom, will never do anything except whatever is most self-indulgent. But that's not actually what self-compassion is, and I'll show you some evidence in a moment. But a recent study by Paul Gilbert looked at how pervasive these fears are, and many people have fears like this, that if they develop a kind of kindness and acceptance towards themselves, they're going to completely fall apart and they'll never succeed in anything, because they are so used to using anxiety, guilt, and shame as the primary motivator in their lives. So people may fear that they will lose their self-criticism and the flaws will show. People will see how messed up I really am if I'm not holding it all in together by beating myself up all the time. People will fear that they will become weak, that their standards will drop, or perhaps sort of another fear that if I actually think about my own suffering, I'm going to become so overwhelmed with sadness and grief that I won't be able to go on. They have a sense that maybe they won't be able to comfort themselves. And again, that is a skill that can be trained. And it turns out that this fear of compassion, of having compassion for yourself, is strongly correlated with the fear of having compassion for others, and a lack of willingness to extend compassion to others. So you can see here that a study found that there was a positive correlation between agreeing with statements like, people will take advantage of me if I'm too compassionate, and these other fears about what will happen if I extend that compassion to myself. This is one of the reasons why in our compassion cultivation training program at the Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, we spend a lot of time training self-compassion, because it really is a foundation for being able to accept others, forgive others, and help others. Okay, so I want to disabuse you of this idea that if you cultivate self-compassion for yourself, you're going to become that couch potato. So here are a few recent studies. Students who are the highest in self-compassion are the least likely to procrastinate. Not the most likely to procrastinate, the least likely. And in fact, a separate study found that the more you beat yourself up for procrastinating studying on the first exam in a quarter, the longer you procrastinate on the next exam. And it's the forgiveness that predicts people who are able to not procrastinate on that second exam. So if you're the kind of person who's using guilt to try to motivate yourself to do better next time, you should know. Research suggests it doesn't work. Okay, self-compassion also predicts re-engagement from goals following a failure. Some of us fear that if we're kind to ourselves after we experience a setback or failure, that means that we're not going to be motivated to do anything else. But actually, it turns out when we're compassionate with ourselves, we're much more likely to get back on the horse and re-engage with the goal, because we're less afraid of future failure. Research also suggests that taking a self-compassionate point of view, so if you take people who maybe aren't always self-compassionate, but ask them to take a more compassionate point of view on a personal failure, they also then take more personal accountability for it. It is easier for them to see what their role was in it and how the whole thing happened. And that is really important for positive change and for learning and for achieving your goals. The willingness to see what role you had and how things maybe went wrong. Self-acceptance also predicts the willingness to receive and act on feedback. That is huge. Again, if you have the tendency to beat yourself up and to be your own worst critic, you really don't want to hear other people's point of view and their criticism because you already feel so miserable. But when you have a kind of safety zone and you can treat yourself with compassion and with forgiveness, it's much easier to hear other people's feedback, learn from it, and act on it. Self-compassion also has turned out to be really good training for people who are trying to change very difficult behaviors, including smoking and binge eating. So one study found that developing self-compassion by cultivating a kind of compassionate voice in your own mind to talk to yourself through difficult situations, including cravings for cigarettes, that helps smokers quit. And another study found that just a one-day training in self-compassion helped obese binge eaters lose weight and was more successful than the standard dieting approach. And finally, self-compassion is associated with the joy of learning for its own sake. And I'm going to be very self-compassionate about the fact there is a big typo in that sentence. No problem. And I think that this finding really points to what self-compassion is. That self-compassion is not letting ourselves off the hook and being self-indulgent. It's about choosing to use our own happiness and our own desire for meaning and connection with others as our primary motivation, as opposed to using guilt, shame, and fear as our primary motivation. And that when we're able to relate to ourselves in a more compassionate way, then we are able to approach things in our life that give us happiness and meaning, and hold ourselves accountable when we get in our own way. Okay, so I encourage you, if you're interested in learning these practices, if I've given you a sense of motivation to learn this, come to the workshop this afternoon and we'll do some of these practices, including the happiness intervention that I talked about at the beginning of this lecture. And I've also put up guided audio versions of all the practices we'll be doing this afternoon for those of you who want to go to some of the other wonderful workshops. So if you want to write down this website, I'll have the slides of this talk, as well as lots of practices that you can begin to implement in your life to develop self-compassion. And enjoy the rest of your day.